Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, absolutely guaranteed to contain no unnatural preservatives, which would also explain why I look so very old. Well, welcome to this continuing series of episodes reviewing and discussing and dissecting and analysing, that's enough verbs, the Edinburgh Festival Fringe for 2016. You may have noticed that I'm trying to mix it up a little bit in how we present those interviews, because some weeks you're getting direct interviews with those people who created the shows, and some weeks we're getting discussions with people about shows, more in a reviewing context. And in a few weeks' time, we'll start getting full episodes dedicated to single shows, where we look at them in much more depth and hear some of the music from those shows. But for today, we're in reviewing mode. And it's a huge pleasure for me to be able to say that at Edinburgh this year was an old friend of Musical Talk, and I hope I can say an old friend of mine, Michael Gordon Shapiro, the noted American composer, who you may remember has been on this programme before, talking about a feast of snacks and the concept of the mini-musical. And you also heard some of his songs in Musical Talk's 2015 Christmas and New Year quiz. Well, Michael and I caught up on several occasions in Edinburgh this year, and not only did we see some shows together, we also saw a lot of shows apart. And so we thought it would be a really good idea to sit down with each other and talk about those things which had really caught our fancy. And so in today's show, we're going to be talking about Stop the Train the musical, a new version of Usher's The Front of House musical, The House of Edgar, and we'll briefly touch upon Van Helsing's Music Box. And so, to get us into the discussion, let's start with a song from the first of those shows, the rather remarkable Stop the Train.
There's been a crash and I'm the wreck. You bailed out to save your neck. There's a hole, and it's you that made it. Someone's lying on the ground. Crowds of people gather around. There's a hole, and it's you that made it. And the last thing that you saw was someone reaching out to you. And the last thing that you heard were your own lies. I've moved up and I've moved on, but the damage that you've done permanently breaks these ties. Look at the damage you've done. Once we were two, now I'm one. You went and left me all alone, and now I stand here on my own. You're gone. Look at the damage you've done.
Falling out and falling down, scattered debris all around. There's a hole, and it's me that made it. Stop the engine, hit the brake. I guess I was on the take. There's a hole, and it's me that made it. And the last thing that I thought was I'd be lost without you. And the last thing I let slip was my disguise. You've moved up and you've moved on, and the damage that I've done, you say permanently breaks these lost ties.
Look at the damage you've done.
Look at the damage I've done.
Once we were two, now I'm one.
Once we were two, now I'm
You
one.
went and left me
I
all
went and
alone.
left you
And now
all
I stand
alone.
here
I'm
on
sorry
my own.
you're gone. Look at the damage we've done.
Look at you now.
Look at you now.
You're faking injury.
Look at you now.
Look at you now.
You blame it all on me. Deep inside, I know you should have never let me go. Look at the damage we've done. Once love was here, now it's gone. We went and left it all
went and
alone.
left it
And
all
now it's left
And
us
now
all
it's
alone.
left us
We
all
caused each other
alone.
senseless
We caused each
pain.
other
We fought
senseless
and
pain.
lost
We
without
fought
a
and
gain.
lost
Love's gone. Look at the damage we've done.
Musical talk. Well, Michael, it's a rare privilege, I think, for me to have an opportunity to have a really good and long chat about, well, the Edinburgh Festival this year, because it's my delight to be able to say I think this is your first trip to Edinburgh.
Second trip to Edinburgh, but first trip to the Fringe Festival, so I'm very excited to be here.
It's a very different Edinburgh, isn't it, during the festival itself? I've been to Edinburgh other times, and it's a very different city. Marvellous in both occasions, but this has a bubble and an excitement, I find, which I find intoxicating. Have you been, how have you found it, dipping your toe into the festival waters, atmosphere-wise, before we even talk about any shows?
Well, I love Edinburgh as a city to begin with. I love the historical architecture and that there are individual cobblestones that are older than my nation of origin. I find it just a very beautiful and interesting place. And add to that the sense of the entire city becoming one giant arts festival. It's really appealing. The sense is that the festival really becomes one with the city, and that any side street you're on will still have a theater and someone trying to hand out flyers. And I've really enjoyed the experience.
I genuinely find it intoxicating, and as you say, you can go to almost any part of Edinburgh. You know, it's concentrated, of course, in the middle, but I travelled by car, foot and bus on one occasion to even outlying places where church halls are having festivals, or the local amateur dramatics group is joining in with the Fringe and doing something. I saw a fantastic thing about W.S. Gilbert for the centenary of his death a few years ago, and it certainly wasn't in the heart of Edinburgh. But today we're here to talk about the musical shows that you've seen and some of which I've seen, just to sort of give a feel and touch upon some of the things that we've found interesting or have caught us in some way. Because quite often even a show which isn't absolutely top-notch will have something in it which, when I say it leaves a taste, not an unpleasant taste I hope, but you go home and you're still thinking about it sometimes. I've seen many shows here. There was one show I sort of dismissed when I was seeing it, and then by the time I got home that night I was thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it and realising it was a much better piece than I had initially thought. And I quite like those pieces that grow on in your memory. It's almost as though they're only planting the seed when you see the show. The actual show is later on when you're piecing it all together.
And one nice thing about the Fringe is that the comparatively low ticket price encourages that kind of experimentation.
Yeah.
If you're looking at Broadway shows, you tend to be very risk averse because you're spending $100+ per ticket. It had better be good. But I don't mind gambling 10, 15 pounds on something that seems interesting. And I've often been pleasantly surprised when I stepped outside of my comfort zone as an audience member.
You're absolutely right. And, forgive me, I suspect you and I are very similar in the sense that we will probably concentrate mostly on musical theatre because that's our bag. But it is very nice to mix something up with that. I enjoy drama anyway, and there are other things as well. And even just walking up and down the Mile, on the little stages there, you can have 20 minutes of an a cappella show or 20 minutes of acrobats, things I would never go and see. But I still see them. Culturally I'm enriched just by walking down the street. I'm impoverished by the Edinburgh experience financially, but I'm enriched culturally. I think that would be fair.
Well put. What you pointed out is actually a pleasant surprise for me, is the element of spontaneous discovery, be through the street buskers and performers, and shows that you might not have seen except somebody stuffed a flyer in your hand and you were about to throw it away, and you looked at the image and said, that looks kind of interesting, maybe I'll check this out.
And the fact that people are happy to talk as well. I quite often find if you engage one of the flyers, particularly if they're involved in the show, they will then talk to you about it. And I don't just mean in a formal environment, I just mean up the mile. You can have a perfectly lovely conversation for 5 minutes with someone you will never see again, but it will be charming and wonderful and informative and interesting, and then they'll tell you what they've seen. And it's not exactly making lifelong friends, but you can certainly make ephemeral, perfect friends.
Momentary friends.
Yes. Well, there's a good name for a song or a show. However, let's talk about, there's at least 2 shows that you and I have seen. In fact, we saw them together. And that was a great experience. It's very nice because, I respect you as a composer and I enjoy your music and I've seen your work performed. But it's so nice to go to a show with a creative person to see how they're reacting to a show and to see if that's different to me as a non-creative person, as a parasite on the body of creativity that I truly am. Let's talk first about, I think, a show which I think was a surprise for both of us. It's called Stop the Train. And what did you think? What did you think about it before you got in?
I was expecting something with a spirit of carpe diem, seize the moment, live your life fully. I was dimly aware that there would be a group of strangers who'd be brought together a la Breakfast Club, or maybe even in the spirit of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where you have people from all walks of life converging and we were going to learn something about them and then they grow. And that's about all I gleaned from the promotional material.
It's funny you should say that, because I took a slightly more dim view of it. I went to see it because it looks like well-produced new writing, and I'm always interested or excited by that. But I was slightly worried about the blurb, because I've seen enough shows in Edinburgh which appear to be, let's take a group of people and put them in an environment where they're going to incidentally meet each other, find out about each one, see if they can then interlock loosely, and then leave them again. Quite often it's incident without meaning. It's just the 8 stories of the 8 people featured or whatever it is. And a particular favourite for these kind of musicals is often trains, because it is the semi-regular nature of meeting people or not. You can be in a group, sitting on a carriage with a completely group of random people you've never seen before, most likely, or if you're on a regular commuter line, you see the same people over and over. So I've seen various shows set on platforms, trains, the underground, and I thought, is this just going to be another one of those? And at one level, I think it was, but actually I think it's the most successful of that, well, I'm going to call it the train strangers model, if you like, that I've seen, because for me it managed to keep moving the goalposts and making it interesting and took us on a journey which wasn't just, let's just passively watch 8 people tell us what their hopes or dreams or failings or secrets are. There was an extra narrative layer, whether it's preposterous or not, that linked it together. I won't carry on talking about it. We'll talk about it a bit more thoroughly. That's my position. So, once you got in, then what did you feel that you got that was different or as you expected?
Well, first of all, I don't feel like I'm spoiling the show by revealing the very first plot twist, because that happens very early in the show, and it's hard to talk about the show without mentioning it. So, as we mentioned, there's a group of strangers from various walks of life on a train. And early in the show, the train is taken over by a kindly old terrorist who's
that is a beautiful description, but absolutely true.
As you like, that's the best I can describe it. He's strapped a homemade bomb to himself, and he threatens to detonate the train unless his demands are met. And his demands are that everybody put down their cell phone and start communicating with each other like people, like human beings, which obviously differs from the motivation of real-world terrorists, but does provide us with a plot device wherein characters can then divulge something about themselves. So he's literally threatening to blow everyone up unless they stand up and sing a song about some hidden truth about themselves.
Now, what I found particularly interesting about that was it's a clever way of adding a facilitator to a story. Because one of the problems I've always had with these kind of stories in the past is that the characters have to stumble across each other in some way and reveal their innermost secrets. Whereas actually, this kindly terrorist, as you call him, which is such a beautiful phrase, is a very good way of, he can control the action. And so suddenly the random nature of it all, the spontaneity, has gone. But actually, I'm going to wrap speech marks around this. That makes it slightly more realistic, at least within the world we're in. because someone is controlling the action. So he can point to someone and say, well, you've been very quiet, tell me your story or I blow us all to kingdom come. It also adds a certain amount of jeopardy. So there's a sense of the story moving towards whatever resolution it's going to have, which actually quite often you don't have with this kind of story. Once you've met the neighbours upstairs and they've told you that they're in love or they're no longer in love, or it's usually love, but or they've got financial problems or whatever it is, you find that the story's almost got nowhere to go. Once you've got to the 8th one, there's usually some contrived way that they all meet each other and have had slight interconnection. But that's not the case here. I just like the hidden narrator role that he actually plays, without being too clumsy.
No, I agree completely. There is a through line, both in the sense of one of the stories being revisited several times, which is a romantic conflict between two estranged former partners who are on the train, as well as the general through line of communicating openly and honestly, I guess being truthful about yourself. Yeah. And in some cases there is a confession of a hidden guilt. I'll reveal one detail.
Yes, I think I know which one you're going to go for as well.
Well, there's actually two, but I was thinking of the Welshman who turns out to have been very financially irresponsible in a way that betrays his apparent personality. I'll go in a sidebar and saying what's interesting about this show is there are a lot of twists, and one is that the apparent personality of the people in the trains is often at odds with who they turn out to be.
That's a good point, actually, yes.
This one I will not spoil, but there's someone who appears to be a very earnest, mousy student, very typical musical theater trope, yes. Someone who has a noble goal, and she's struggling against incredible odds to accomplish this goal, and it turns out what she wants is not quite as noble as it seems on the surface. We're going to leave this one as a surprise, but we're both chuckling because it was a very funny twist.
Well, actually, I think you make a very good point there as well, because all the way through, this is very funny. And that's it has drama, and we'll talk in a minute, I'm sure, about the sense of edge which is retained throughout the piece to build up to that jeopardy. But it's also very funny. So many of the reveals are the funny aspects of it. But there's also some very punchy dialogue. There's one character, she's a beautician, and she rather fancies herself. She thinks she's quite the best-looking person in the carriage. Whether she is entirely in the eye of the beholder, I think. But she's got her dreams. It's easy to sneer at people's dreams if you consider yourself to be above them. But, she would like to be what's called in this country a wag, which is a wife and girlfriend of a footballer. And so she's a beauty technician, and her ambition is to snag a famous footballer and thereby find the easy life. And, forgive me, as a middle-aged, middle-class person, a man as well, that's not something I aspire to. And it's easy to sneer upon it, but there's actually no reason why that isn't. I mean, in her, it is what she wants, and she genuinely wants it. It's not fake. She turns out to be a very sincere character. She's quite damaged as well, so she's quite sparky in the way she speaks, but she's got a very streetwise, I don't mean in the 1980s, buttock-clenchingly embarrassing way. She's just very, she's of the people, and she's going to fight for what she believes in as well. She's actually quite a refreshing character, in the sense that if she were in another musical, you might be invited to sneer at her lack of ambition. But it's very clear to me that actually she has a genuine ambition. It's not one I share, but you are encouraged, or you are eventually encouraged to see that it's a perfectly legitimate thing for her. I was quite interested by that as a character, but she's very funny, which was the point I was making earlier. And so many of these, let's meet the neighbours, aren't we all having a terrible time, neurosis and jealousy are destroying our lives. This is heavily sweetened with, I think, good character comedy, actually, for the most part.
And to your point, one thing I noticed that the show did very well was assign each character a very individual vocabulary and diction and manner of speaking, so they really felt fleshed out as people. And each one would have his or her own way of chiming in on events. It felt very naturally. You think, oh yeah, that is what the Welshman would say, that is what the girl from the north would say. I was amused, there's one American character, and I was amused by the conscientious inclusion of a lot of Americanisms. My favorite was when he called the terrorist a douche. To me, that rang true.
Yes, which isn't really a British term, to be honest. It may have been picked up merely from Family Guy, where it's used a lot, I believe, which is more or less streamed 24 hours a day on the British television. So.
It sounded very natural to me, so I think that helped a great deal. That little attention to detail really helped in making characters who could have been comic tropes really feel as three-dimensional as you'd expect in a musical comedy.
But let's just talk about some of the production aspects which rather impressed me. It's quite easy for, you would have thought, a show set in a train carriage, essentially, from first to last, to be rather static in how it feels. and they had proper looking sort of train seats in that kind of sort of blue plaid which you see on all British trains somehow, but they were on wheels. And what they would do is they would have the ensemble pieces where the discussion was taking place in relation to the plot, and then the scenery would be rolled away, and there'll be heavy use of video projection to contextualize or enhance whatever revelation was being given by whatever character was speaking about.
Right.
If you like, it was, the camera of the eye was drawn to the train window, because the video was set as a sort of the wall of a train carriage in the background, and then you would go through the window, and as you went through the window you get into this sort of fantasy world of whatever we were having revealed to us. But what I really liked was the fact that when the set reassembled itself, sometimes they would turn it round. And so it wasn't always in the same direction, people weren't always sitting in the same seat. They were always sitting in the same seat in relation to themselves, but actually we as the audience had the set turned round. So it's not exactly a revolve, because it's the set on wheels. But actually I thought that was that stopped it getting static, because you had to reorient yourself every time. And that you could almost say that's symbolic of the piece, because actually after every revelation you were having to reorient your understanding of what was going on in this story as well. I may be reading too much into this, but I rather like the direction.
No, you stole my comment. I was going to say it was literally changing our perspective on the characters, which was a great way of metaphorically having the set reflect what was going on and also keep us from getting bored by looking at the same visual over and over again.
What did you think of the video use? Was it good? Was it bad? Because video can overwhelm what's going on the stage, because we live in a world where if there's a television in a room, our eyes are automatically directed to the screen. It just seems to be what happens. Nothing to be done about it. So that being the case, did you think it enhanced or not?
I did, and generally what I find is that if video is atmospheric and does not overwhelm the action in the foreground, it can be a very nice way to localize you to a time and place without some character having to say, well, here we are on the train. So it's very handy for that. It's kind of tacit exposition, which I really liked. There were a few bits when they were playing narration by, I guess, the conductor of the train who had some announcements.
Oh, that's right, yes.
That were both very funny as well as thematically related, because it was showing some aspects of work life on the train that were a little impersonal and cold in some cases. So I thought it was very tasteful overall.
It's funny you should say that, yes, because absolutely, I mean, without, as you say, he's not actually germane to the plot, but if you like, he's almost a Greek chorus in one sense. He comes, for some reason you see the face of the chief conductor, the chief guard on the train, but he's talking about the retirement of one of his colleagues on the train. And he wants people to wish her well. And what it reminds you actually is there is a community on the train which we as commuters would never see, to be honest, or would never think about actually. So it does bring some nice things to the fore. Let's talk score. What did you think of the score?
I found the score enjoyable, but less memorable than the show as a whole. There were
a stronger book, really.
Exactly right, and stronger lyrics as well. There were a number of pastiche numbers that were very colorful and meant to reflect the characters' personalities. The womanizing American had a kind of a Glenn Miller, Tom's going in swing rhythm thing going on.
Well, at the beginning, I thought we were going to get a slight rip-off of Sing, 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 because that drum
was, exactly right.
It was a heavy borrowing in terms of percussion.
Well, it's a trope. Musically, it's a trope, and it tells you this is kind of the wild jungle beat and meant to symbolize male passion in a kind of classy but tawdry way, or tawdry but classy.
Well, that's actually very good, isn't it? Because he's a bit of an egotist, that character, isn't he? He's a money man. He works in the city. He's very well dressed, but in his fantasies, the ambition for him is to be surrounded by beautiful women in a warehouse full of money and plastic, presumably. Generally having a good time. He looked like he was into champagne and women, shall we say. With just that touch of self-love as well, because he spends quite a lot of the video shirtless, and then at the end, when he comes back to, if you like, the reality of the train, he sort of rips open his shirt front in a kind of sort of, I'm so in that moment flourish. I mean, he's faintly embarrassed that he's done that in front of everyone. It's just a throwaway. I'm sure the actor doesn't mind, because but I quite like that, because you saw his excess. It was a very excessive piece in context with the character. Any other of the video moments you thought were jolly?
By video moments, do you mean the song breaks?
Yes, because the video moments nearly always correspond with whatever revelation is coming, with the exception of the love songs later on, actually.
That's true. So there are two types of song in the score. You've got these solo numbers which reveal the secret truth or the inner truth that's been withheld. The hairdresser has a very funny, kind of a retro 80s piece that was a little reminiscent of Hey Mickey by Tony Basil. That absolutely captured her character. The thing is with pastiche numbers is unless there's some really original spin on them, we tend to recognize them, enjoy them, and move on. And the meat of a score tends to be the material that's a little more stylistically original. Here there was an opening number that was, I would say, a typical contemporary musical theater piece about feeling isolated and lonely. This is before the kindly old terrorist climbs aboard and announces his agenda.
Just his stuff, yes.
And there's some romantic numbers later that are cut from the same cloth. And I thought they were effective. I'm not sure anything really lingers with me, and certainly not as much as the characters in the book, which I thought were very strong.
And you mentioned the lyrics. So were there any particular linguistic flourishes that you found appealing?
Unfortunately, there's been about 13 musicals since we saw that, and today, so some of the detail has fled my memory.
I was a little bit worried earlier on because the first revelation we get is from, as you say, from the financially enstraitened Welsh gentleman. A beautiful character, by the way. You get who he is quite quickly, I think, nicely delineated by his performer. And he sings this song about, basically, he's putting everything on winning the lottery, which is not necessarily a good plan for the future. And he sings this song, which is very funny, and it's called "I'm Waiting for My Balls to Drop." Now, obviously, but you've just pulled a face, and I felt the same way. I thought, I hope we're not just going to have what I will call carry-on double entendre all the way through this. The song itself worked nicely, but it seemed, as a punchline, I actually thought that song was one of the weaker ones because it was throwing away its purpose and content for a laugh line on a chorus, when actually some of the other songs I think were a bit more characterful. So I'm very glad that we didn't have anything else that was a bit what I would call British seaside sort of postcard, saucy stuff. As in inoffensively saucy, but it was a double entendre which actually didn't really give us much. It gave you a quick laugh, but it cheapened what it was doing, I thought. And actually, I thought the rest of it was very good. That's not to say that was a bad song. I just felt that it threw itself away.
I am inclined to agree. Every joke has a lifespan, and the lifespan of the joke, "I'm waiting for my balls to drop," is exactly one iteration of the joke.
Yes.
So when that becomes the refrain, I found I was kind of clutching at my seat a little bit and waiting for it to be over. But that was a bit of a stumble at the gate. The rest of the score, where there was humor, I thought was very well done. It was very funny, not too over the top, sufficiently over the top, I would say.
Yes, but it straddled the balance, didn't it, as well? I mean, it was still able to get its sincerity through. And I don't want to dwell too much on this because we'll move on to the next show in a minute, but before we were recording on another occasion, you were saying that one of the lovely things about the kindly old terrorist is actually he does have teeth. So he doesn't just come on, it's not a case of he comes on, frightens everyone, and then becomes benevolent. He veers between benevolent and actually being sincere in his terrorism, shall we say. Or you are left wondering if he is. There is no moment, or you're not allowed to linger with a moment where you think, actually, well, he's now just going to be the kindly old man. There's more to him than that.
Exactly right. Every musical has to have a burning necessity at its core that drives the story. And in this case, it was fear of being detonated by this terrorist.
Which is a good enough.
well, that's a fine motivation, but the problem is when a terrorist tells you that his agenda is for you to communicate better as people, you intuit there's not going to be a Hamlet-like pile of bodies at the end of the show. You think, okay, it's a little morality tale, he's never going to actually do anything. And in anticipation of that problem, the show writers really threw a couple of curveballs at us, so that our security that he was completely benevolent was thwarted. We kind of thought, oh, maybe he is crazy. Maybe these guys had better divulge their inner truths and make it snappy, or else there's going to be a real catastrophe here. So I'm impressed by that.
I also like the fact that he was given just one tiny little throwaway line for motivation. And it's almost he says it by accident. And then they don't dwell on it. I actually quite like the fact that his genuine motivation for doing whatever it is he finally does is not revealed. I actually quite like that ambiguity. They've just planted enough to let you know that he is motivated by something, and you can guess at it, but you can't know it is, if that makes sense.
I agree. I was dreading that he was going to step up and do a soulful, sad number about the thing in his past that set him off on this path, and that he didn't, and that the authors left it to us to imagine actually made it more powerful.
Yeah, much the stronger. I think on the whole we're saying that Stop the Train was actually a good, effective piece.
I agree. I was much more engaged by it than I anticipated, and that's not a backhanded compliment. There is a ludicrous premise to accept,
yes,
which is the kindly old terrace, but once you can swallow that pill, it's actually a moving piece, and it's funny, and it does its job.
It's coherent in its own world, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, the other show that we saw together was actually Usher's The Front of House musical. Now, regular listeners to Musical Talk will know that I saw a professional version of that up here in Edinburgh last year, which I adored. I thought it was fantastic, and I've been raving about it ever since. I've also been to see it when it was revived again in London very briefly, and enjoyed it again there, although it lacked the atmosphere slightly. Edinburgh really made it come alive. It's back again here this year with a totally different cast. In fact, it's a university cast. It's Dewlog, which is the Durham University Light Opera Group. They are a regular here in Edinburgh every year, and they usually put in a good performance. Not always, but they usually put in a good performance, and they usually do what they've done not just very well, but they pick their pieces quite nicely. So I was quite pleased to see a different Ushers. But it's your first experience of Ushers, because I think it's a particularly British piece, I must say. I don't think it's travelled. What was your take on it as a piece?
I'll open with a side and say I first learned about this musical through Musical Talk. Through a prior episode of this very podcast, subsequently went to Edinburgh and saw it, and now I'm talking about it on Musical Talk, which is a weird kind of secular experience.
Yes.
Some serious recursion going on here.
I'll have a word with Escher to draw the diagram of that, if you like.
Remind me what the question was.
Well, what did you think of Ushers as a piece?
I thought it had a lot going for it. It is very funny, and it has a very joyous wit to it. There's a lot of satire of life behind the scenes, I guess at a West End theatrical environment, and you don't really need to be a West End insider to catch the jokes and at least intuit the nature of the references, even if not every single name hits home. There's a lot of wit driven by a boorish boss of the David Brent school,
yes.
Very full of himself.
He's called Robin Pockets.
Robin Pockets, yeah, it was very funny. Very dictatorial, very coarse in a way that's enjoyable. And the humor really helped sustain my interest from moment to moment. The music is either, strictly speaking, as music, it's either criminally catchy, as with the case of the opening number, that is stuck in my head, or legitimately touching in the case of some of the soulful ballads. So I think score is very strong, and the mood and atmosphere and energy of the show is very appealing. The problem I had with the show is that I didn't know whose story it was.
And this is the very issue I wanted to discuss with you, so thank you.
Perfect. I'll contextualize this a little bit for the audience who might not have seen it. When we start the story, we are following a point of view character named Lucy, who is a newcomer, and she is taken under the wings of several veteran ushers at this theater, and they show her the ropes, and they explain some of the foibles of working at the theater and what life is like, and we see her as very earnest and very positive and aspirational, so we think, okay, here's our main character, and we're along for the ride. We're going to learn about the world of ushing, the front of house world, as she learns about it. Perfect classical protagonist. And then some strange things happen. She falls immediately in love with Stephen. And there's no conflict there. They just kind of gaze into each other's eyes. They play this for laughs. You hear a little pink on the piano, and it's clear that they are predestined as partners. And they have a moment alone, and she prompts Steve to reveal his dreams, and he sings a soulful I Want style ballad about I would love to be an actor on the stage. And we figure, okay, well, that's a little weird. Why are we hearing his I Want song when she's the protagonist? And then she turns around as a moment alone, and she gives her soulful ballad, which is her I Want song, and it's the same song, essentially. It's I want to be a big thespian. And I thought that's also weird, because she just had her thunder stolen by who I assume is the romantic interest character. This is very odd. And as the show goes on, she recedes into the background, and suddenly gradually we realize that we are actually following the trajectory of two completely different characters. And they are a couple who are facing a conflict, because one of them has gotten an acting gig in Austria, which will put him away for a year, and the other one doesn't have faith that the relationship's going to last the stress of long distance.
This is Ben and Gary.
Ben and Gary. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable conflict, and it is something we can get behind, but we haven't really been following their point of view. They've seemed like secondary characters from the beginning, and I've mentally categorized them that way, and I haven't had that bond with them that you get in a musical with the main character. So halfway through the show, I find I have to really change gears and reassign my affection to a completely different set of characters. And again, there's nothing unreasonable about their conflict, but I've never seen their relationship before. I've never seen the good times. There's no flashback showing them running through the fields and throwing flowers over their head. So I don't really know what
You have a much more romantic life than I do, I tell you.
or going to the movies or whatever. Or
Yes.
the point is, I don't really know what their life was like before. It was never demonstrated to me, so I can't quite buy into their struggle. It's like watching something on the news. I feel bad, but I wasn't really there along with them. So I was really disoriented in the show, and I didn't form that kind of click sympathy with a protagonist that you need in a musical for their songs to really get you. I felt sympathy, but not a bond.
But not empathy. Yeah.
Not empathy, exactly.
Yes,
not the specific kind of empathy that is necessary to any successful musical. And so for that reason, it didn't feel like the show did not reach its full potential, at least in my eyes.
It's very interesting you should say that, because we have sort of discussed this a little bit before the recording on another occasion. That it subverts, I think, the primary and secondary coupledom, which you've just explained very nicely. And for shorthand purposes only, I'm going to refer to them as the straight couple and the gay couple, because that just makes them easy to identify. But in this, you're quite right. You are led to believe quite early on that the straight couple are going to be the main couple because they are getting together, and the gay couple have a problem, and they're going to try and resolve that. But that's, if you like, in classical musical comedy mode, they would be the comedy second character, or characters, or couple. You know, that goes all the way back to the sort of the 1920s and Gershwin numbers. You know, you go and see Lady Be Good, there's always a secondary, usually a silly ass couple, you know.
The romantic
Yes.
auxiliary couple,
That,
right?
if you like, yes, but they're the funny romantic couple. And yet, immediately, I think in this, and you make you make the point, they see each other, it's love at first sight. There's this kind of ding, as you quite rightly say, and I think from the moment the ding takes place, I think that's when the subversion takes place, because I think they are immediately sent up, and because they're immediately sent up, it's like they then fall into the secondary comedy role. And we're then suddenly introduced to the people, the gay couple in this case, who are going to take the primary romantic role, but theirs is the reverse of what would normally be the case. It's not how does a couple get together, it's how does, in this case, how does a couple stop themselves breaking up. Which is an interesting, on paper, that's a very interesting way forward. I quite like the fact there's a central gay couple. I quite like the fact that their problem is the stopping a breakup rather than stopping a breakup in a comedy is quite an interesting balance, quite an interesting thing to try and do. And then you're quite right, the Lucy character is more or less pushed to the background. I mean, she turns up every now and then and gets involved, but it's a very sort of light romance. You know, it's not. They get together very quickly and very easily. She and
There's
Steve.
no conflict.
Yeah, they get it. Yeah, boy meets girl, full stop, essentially. And such the jeopardy, the sincere jeopardy, is the jeopardy of the gay couple, and the insincere jeopardy, if I may call it that way, is the problems caused by Robin Pockets and his appallingly, comically odious behaviour.
Looking at the humor of that character, first of all, he was very funny, and the actor did a great job of channeling the spirit of the sort of David Brent tyrannical boss, who's yet full of himself and charming in a vulgar sort of way. There was a real lost opportunity, however, because I felt that Robin Pockets was a little too self-aware of his own evilness. And he would say things like, he would allude to the fact that he would sexually harass new hires. And I think it's much funnier when a villain always thinks he's in the right or she's in the right and rationalizes everything that they do as being proper in some way. And when someone comes out and says, well, I'm a jerk, I'm your worst nightmare, et cetera, it's actually less funny.
Yes, do you know what? I do accept that, but I think he's trading on seediness. And certainly, and I don't know if this is a cultural thing, but there's a long tradition of seedy, lovable comic characters in this country. There was a very long-running sitcom featuring a much-lamented British comic actor called Leonard Rossiter called Rising Damp. And he was a seedy landlord in the extreme. And if you actually met him, you would hate him. But in the context of the sitcom in which this character appeared, you actually sort of like him. He's very much the anti-hero, even though there are sort of young romantic men and young romantic women in the piece. It all revolves around the Leonard Rossiter character. That's just one example. I think there is a kind of, and he knows that he's worthless. This is in the sitcom. And I think, well, does Robin Pockets think he's worthless? Actually, I think Robin Pockets thinks he doesn't think he's worthless. I think he feels hard done by, because we know that he was going to become an opera singer, and then the money ran out, so he couldn't complete it. So he's sort of taking out an unpleasant, seedy vengeance on the world. I think I may have just talked myself out of my own point. In which case, yes, your point rests.
Well, I think having a seedy character is great. I think he's a wonderful comic foil for everybody's earnestness. But I think it would be funnier if he was more delusional and had less insight about his own defects. If he thought everything he was doing was actually proper, I find from a comic standpoint that is more effective than There's a moment where he humiliates an actual latecomer to the theater, and it's worked into the fabric of the show by imagining that we are during a production, and then he's coming out and humiliating a latecomer. And this has a long history, and as a creator of shows, I'm for the humiliation of latecomers. However, he does this by announcing essentially that he's now going to torture the person. And in doing so, he steps out of the character and he steps through the fourth wall and just says, hey, everyone, let's have fun at this person's expense. And I think it's better to stay in character and criticize the person from the standpoint of what I'm doing is rightful vengeance, not that I'm being a jerk to you intentionally. So this may be splitting hairs, but I think it's worth noting that there was an opportunity to make him funnier.
That's a very interesting point. Talking about being in character, it's just worth throwing away as a comment that actually the actors playing the ushers are the people who then check your tickets on the door, not the usual staff at the venue, in this case C, which I quite like. But I accept the point you're making about Robin, although I think that's very much that's a panto moment in British panto terms, where actually everything stops for a bit of interaction with the audience, in this case at the expense of one member of it, a latecomer. But there is, I think, a long tradition in this country of everyone just sort of folding back and doing that, thank God it's not me. And, well, you could probably hear the buttocks clenching across the auditorium, frankly. But I accept what you're saying. There is that balance between staying in character and heightening a comedy, or actually going for the understood British panto response to breaking the fourth wall. It is a much bigger part, I think, of British theatrical culture. I wouldn't like to say whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I would like to talk about lyrics just briefly, because I agree with what you're saying. I think the score is, on the whole, a very catchy score, and it is a score that travels with you. I've still got the songs in it from when I saw it last year. I've then subsequently bought the album, and I've never been able to get some of the buggers out of my head since, I must say. I will say I think that the music is slightly better than the lyrics. I think there's a little bit of pop lyricism going on there. There's a few I would consider false rhymes. But you made a very interesting point. As we walked out of it, you asked me how the British pronounce the word ice cream.
Oh, right.
Would you like to sort of explain your thinking on that particular song, which is a Lucy song, in fact?
It is. This was sort of an unintentionally funny moment. So the general topic is some of the highfalutin details that lyricists really care about, such as making sure that the stresses of a word, the accented syllables, fall in the right place when those words are set to music. And there is a moment at the end of Lucy's soulful ballad where she says, I had all these aspirations, I'm paraphrasing obviously, I had all these aspirations, and instead I find myself selling programs and ice cream. And that's the end of the song. But when those words are set to music, it sounds like she's saying, I find myself selling programs and I scream. And that's just because of the prosody, the misalignment of the natural rhythm of the words when it was musicalized. And I thought, that's a really dark ending to that song. Is that what they intended? So I thought, well, maybe it's a British thing, and they actually pronounce it, like you pronounce weekend. We say weekend, you say weekend. So it's
off to the weekend. Yes, I probably do, yes.
It's kind of an I am versus a trochee in highfalutin terms. So I thought
keep them coming.
This is another case where there's just a difference in pronunciation. So I thought maybe it's ice cream in the UK.
Well, because you asked me that question, and I sort of fudged it a bit afterwards. Fudge ice cream, that would be. Because I actually think both pronunciations are used. Ice cream, and should we have some ice cream? So I do think that you can put the emphasis on the second word, but actually I've been thinking about this very point since you raised it with me. Because actually, and I've been talking to myself and asking about ice cream. I don't know what the people in the room next to me think I'm doing. They think I'm obsessed. And I haven't even had an ice cream. I haven't even scratched that itch. But I actually realised in normal conversation, we would say, I'm going to have an ice cream. And it is a homonym with ice cream, which is the point you were making. And so actually you've opened up my eyes to the double meaning of that song, which I'm guessing is there, and I suspect, at least I hope deliberately so, To give it that, you can either have the pathetic ending, which is I'm here amongst programmes and the confectionery ice cream, or the, as you say, the dark ending, which is I'm here amongst the programmes and it makes me scream, just to paraphrase the meanings of the two possibilities. Now, I had never taken the darker meaning, but actually I really like that, and I'm hoping it's a planned thing and not just an accident.
I'm not willing to let them off the hook that easily. I think there were enough cases of strange accents on syllables. The lyrical craftsmanship was not up to the level of quality that the music was. There were, as you say, a number of semi-rhymes or near rhymes and things that didn't quite work. There was nothing that took me out of the show, but I tend to notice these little details. So in this case, this is the one case where it actually mattered, because I was temporarily confused and I didn't know what the mood of the song was meant to be because I couldn't understand the lyric there.
Oh, that's interesting. Right, yes. Well, I just let it float over me, because I did assume it was the confectionery ice cream. But as I say, it's only subsequently I've really been enjoying thinking about what it might be. I do like Ushers as a piece. I think it's a jolly little piece. It has its structural quirks. It has its structural kinks and quirks. You see what I did there? And but actually, on the whole, I think it's... Well, actually, I take your initial response the moment it finished, the moment the lights came up in the auditorium and we were leaving. You said, well, that was a fun piece. And I thought, well, I think actually, in the most simplistic terms, I don't mean that negatively, that's exactly what it is. It's light. You know, it's a fairly ephemeral piece. I don't think it's ever going to set the world alight. It's ideal for festivals and things like this. It comes back to the West End every now and then. But it is a small piece in the West End. It can only be a drop in the ocean, whereas here it's a bigger piece, or it can be a bigger piece. So on the whole, I have to say, I always enjoy it. But it was interesting to me to see a professional cast last year and a talented amateur cast this year, and just see the difference. I will make one observation on interpretation. Ben, who is the member of the gay couple who is staying in the country, as opposed to Gary, who's got the job in Austria. Last year, Ben's role was played with a great deal of hurt. And sort of wound licking, if I may say, whereas Ben in this performance, and it's a perfectly legitimate acting choice, is petulant with his anger. But the problem with petulance is it can remove the sympathy for the character. So last year I had a great deal of sympathy with the Ben character, because you could see, although I could understand both positions I could see what was causing the trouble for them, both. The actor played it with so much sort of pain and hurt, but your heart goes out to them. Whereas here, when someone's being petulant, it's harder to feel sympathy for that character, and I think that character needs sympathy, because petulance and anger are very difficult, A, to maintain, and secondly, very difficult to engage with on an emotional level, or certainly an empathy-based level. That's all I'd say on that, I think. So that's Ushers. Now, I wonder if you might like to tell me about the Edgar Allan Poe piece, which you raved about when we met a couple of times here across Edinburgh, and you said something delightful. You said you'd seen a number of shows, but it was the Edgar Allan Poe show which had really sort of made it all worthwhile for you. So that's high praise. I haven't seen it. Tell me all about it.
Well, I should also add to that I saw the show fairly early in the Fringe, and I'd just gone through a stream of seeing a few shows that were well-intended but not that strong, and even though it was only day 2 or so, my morale was taking a little bit of a dip, so I was really delighted to find something that was both moving and intellectually stimulating and musically very compelling and gorgeous. So I may
dragged
have
your average right up.
Exactly. And subsequent to that, I've actually seen a number of shows that I've really liked. So I do not want to make it seem like this was the sole beacon of light in a soul-crushing darkness or anything like that. But I really did like the show, and I did suggest thus that he see it, which he then didn't do. So
I haven't been able to, no.
Shows the weight of my opinion around here. The name of the show is The House of Edgar, and it's produced by the Argosy Theatre Company. No promises that I pronounced any of those words correctly, except
I think
perhaps
theatre very well done. Yes.
Good. It's been long enough that I should
all of that was fine.
That. The show is, here's how I'll describe it. It is both a tribute to Edgar Allan Poe and his works, as well as an original work of art that is of a similar style. And the way that it manages to fulfill both roles is very interesting. The story takes place a few weeks after Poe's death, and we are introduced to one of his colleagues, a man named Rufus Griswold, who we assume is also an author, a fiction author, and he's showing up at Poe's house to take ownership, because he is, for reasons which may or may not have been explained, he's the sole heir of Poe's estate. I think it's mentioned that Poe had no family and no loved ones, so maybe he was person number 12 on the list, and he hit the jackpot. So he's come to take the keys of the house, and there is a protective executor there, a lawyer, who has to turn over the keys, and he's very reluctant. And it's clear quickly that Griswold is not a fan of Poe. He's actually quite contemptuous of his colleague.
Right.
And he, even as he shows up to take over all of Poe's possessions in his homes, he is basically dissing on Poe's work. He says he's needlessly grim. He just uses synonym after synonym of death. He's obviously our dramatic foil. And
He sounds, if I may make the observation, a bit Poe-faced. Poe-faced means humorless.
Oh, interesting.
I'm so sorry.
If I were more of a worldly person, I would have caught that pun. So he shows up, he is ready to take over everything, and the executor is actually taken aback by this, and the executor is a big fan of Poe, so he begins defending the work. And our visitor says, well, you seem like you're not doing so well financially. How about I'll toss $20 your way if you can give me an example of Poe's work that you think has artistic merit. And this framing device gives us the pretext for the presentation of several of Poe's works, his poems and short stories, obviously abridged because we don't have all day.
Yes.
And each becomes a little episode that is musicalized and dramatically enacted before our eyes. And it's done with such artistry that you do not feel like you're seeing a chopped up, truncated version of The Raven. The Raven is basically infinitely long. It goes on forever. And
there's a feature film being made of it, isn't there? In the 1960s.
Huh, I didn't know that.
It's a Roger Corman piece. It's actually one of the most successful Roger Corman pieces. So it is actually worth catching.
Well, that is a low bar to hop over. So, in any case, if you're listening, Roger, I'm a big fan. We go through a succession of these reenactments of Poe's works, and this is the element where it's sort of a tribute. And at first you might think, well, this is really more of a review of Poe, and the story surrounding it is just a framing device to give us an excuse to go all into them. And that turns out not to be true. The outer story turns out to be a legitimate story in its own right, and we follow the journey of Griswold as he runs into several strange circumstances. And here I'm going to be very vague because I do not want to give away any of the twists of the show. But suffice to say that in a Poe-like fashion, a lot of our expectations are suddenly shaken. And some very... I'm going to err on the side of not giving things away. I'll just say
I think that's sensible.
Stuff you didn't expect happens. But the end result, I know that's satisfyingly specific. The end result is it's actually quite moving and gripping. Even after we've seen a number of small episodes, each one of which in itself is actually quite moving. The depiction of Annabel Lee is very touching. There's this truncated version of The Raven, which is musically gorgeous. As I speak right now, the melody to the musicalization of The Raven is stuck permanently in my head, and it really needs to be exorcised. I think there is reference to the Telltale Heart and The Pendulum and a few others. So you get this introduction to Poe's work that I think would be compelling for someone who hadn't really experienced any of it, and you also get a real original story at the same time. So all this is very impressive and very earnest and full of the rich detail that really makes a story come to life and feel compelling. And the score is gorgeous.
How do you make a story? Because it sounds interesting. There's this sense, as you say, there's an anthology and a framework, but the framework is more than a framework, it is a story in its own right. So it's a proper integrated book and narrative.
It is.
One thinks Edgar Allan Poe, one thinks obviously dark, macabre, gothic, shall we say, mid-19th century. I've seen so many potentially interesting historic stories ruined by deeply inappropriate scores. There's nothing wrong with a rock score, but I once saw a very delicate story about the death of the son of Kenneth Grahame, the man who wrote The Wind in the Willows, with the most thumpingly over-the-top rock score, bless it. But every time the orchestra started, you were completely taken out of the story, because it just didn't... that's not to say that an 18th century story, which is a 19th century, but an 18th century story can only be scored by a harpsichord. Obviously, the world is a much broader place than that, but you have to get it right. So I'm really interested to hear what you're going to say on this.
The score is best described as Gothic folk, and it may be because I stole that term from their promotional material, or maybe I came up with it, I don't remember. It is, there's some roots in folk music, maybe more British folk music than American. There is a harmonic element that gives you that sense of Gothic, supernatural things afoot. The score is very accessible, but at the same time very lyrical and beautiful and harmonically sophisticated. There's quite a bit of vocal harmony, which is perfectly performed. The technical execution of the score, it was impressive in its own right, separate from how much I liked the music. So I'll leave off by saying it's the right blend of feeling emotionally gripping and also a little bit unsettling as befits the subject matter.
I tell you what I'm hearing. I'm sort of hearing resonances with The Hound of the Baskervilles, and obviously I know that Conan Doyle is one of the heirs to Poe, so that will make perfect sense, but that's sort of dark, macabre, slightly supernatural stuff going on. That's in terms of a narrative. Is it complete? And I'll tell you why I asked the question, because I passed a poster for it today, which has now been adorned with stars, but one of the quotations on the poster I saw was sketches for an eventual masterpiece, or something along those lines. So does it feel like a complete piece, or do you feel that you're seeing something that will one day be I assume it's a one-act piece?
It is.
Do you think it'll ever make it to full length, by which I mean, 2.5 hours and 2 acts? Or?
Well, I'll answer by saying that in its current form, which is an hour and change, it's completely satisfying to me. I didn't feel like I was seeing something that was excerpt or truncated.
Oh, right.
As I understand sometimes happens at the Fringe.
Yeah.
There are some shows I saw where I really felt whatever excisions they'd made. I felt like certain relationships weren't convincing because they were rushed, and I suspect that may have been a casualty of this abridgment.
You do see it, yes.
And when shows go to Las Vegas, the same sort of thing happens. They'll just chop out 20 minutes because nobody's attention span could possibly span an hour and a half. So in this case, I didn't really feel it. The pacing definitely accelerated at the end, but that's something you want to happen towards the end of a show anyway.
You don't want it to be too languid when you're building up to some kind of ending.
Exactly right. So the first half or so is modular in that there's a series of recreations of Poe's works, and you could obviously add to that. You could toss in a few more and make the show longer that way. There might be some opportunities for extending the ending, the dramatic climax that I won't tell you anything about. There's some opportunities to adjust the pace, but I didn't feel like I was seeing something that was too short.
And another question may I ask, because I think of Poe in two senses. I think of Poe as very American. And oddly, I also think of him as faintly French. I suspect that's because one or two of his most famous stories are set in France. The Rue Morgue, the murder in Rue Morgue, is that right?
That sounds correct.
And I don't know why I always get this slightly French sense from him, even though he's absolutely, a firmly American writer. But you said you thought the folk was influenced more by British folk, so I'm guessing it's a British piece. Is that what you're saying?
From what I could tell, the production company is British. I think there may have been one or two American actors, but it may just been very polished accents that fooled me.
And this was, as far as you can tell, it's the premiere. It's not been somewhere else. It's not a known show which has come to Edinburgh. It's new writing. That
I don't know, actually.
I'm very intrigued by it, though, because it's been getting stars aplenty everywhere, a proper constellation, frankly. So it's been interesting that you back that up from your position. So you were talking about the success of the score. The lyrics?
This is unfortunately another case where there's been 15 shows since now and then. I remember that the dialogue was very sophisticated, and I think I had similar impressions of the lyrics. Now, some are obviously paraphrases of Poe's writing, so no complaints there. I walked away with a good impression, and unfortunately I can't remember any more detail.
And so for the body of the piece, it seems to me that Poe is there almost as a phantom, because it's about Poe, but people discussing Poe, rather than one of those shows where Poe himself turns up at the beginning and says, "Oh, this is my story." I quite like that sometimes. It's sometimes a character is almost best delineated by the gap they leave. And I get a sense that certainly, I don't know how it progresses, but certainly you get that at the beginning. Certainly it's about the absence of Poe at the beginning. And I quite like that, moving around the gap. It's like the Pompeii bodies. They found a hole in the ash, they filled it with plaster of Paris, and that's how they know what they look like, kind of thing.
Well, very much so, because the story is set in his wake. I mean, not the ceremony of his wake, but his absence. It's the
only a few weeks,
wrangling over his estate. And I can add that certain things in Poe's history and the history of the point of view character do play prominently into the story. So we definitely feel Poe's influence throughout.
I'm actually going to add a little semicolon to that discussion, actually, if I may, with a show that borrows a conceit from that, but is entirely different in tone. And I'm going to be very honest, much less successful by the sound of it, but I saw something called Van Helsing's Music Box. Now, I think you can tell from the title of that it's a romp. And I would say it's a funny old piece. It's supposed to be funny, and it is funny. It's not supposed to be heavy or meaningful. It has no... I wrap these words in speech marks, but it has no worth in that sense. But if you're looking for a light-hearted romp, it was very jolly. But the conceit of it, and this is the main reason I'm mentioning it, is that we are at an auction. Because Van Helsing, the vampire slayer of Dracula, has died, and his effects are being auctioned by this auctioneer. And there are various people seeking to buy these artefacts. And it's not quite the same thing, but it's this immediate death, disposal of artefacts kind of concept from which you then hang stories. In this case, a very silly sort of pantomime-esque thing where various vampires were trying to buy memorabilia that had been stolen from their families by Van Helsing during his travels. So, we're talking silly romp. The score, funnily enough, was much better than the script. Some of the songs are actually quite jolly, but that's all I'm going to say about Van Helsing's Music Box, but to say that it's nice to see or hear about odd parallels done totally differently, and with different levels of sophistication, I think. Well, thank you, Michael. We've discussed 3 shows in quite detail, and on the whole, I would say all 3 shows all sound and were very successful or have great potentiality in them. Certainly they've all given us something that we can take home and continue to think about, because we have been thinking about these shows since we saw them, and that doesn't always happen, particularly in a world where, as you've quite rightly pointed out, the melee of other shows that you're seeing as well. It's quite difficult to stand out when you are seeing 5 shows a day. So I think those 3 shows sound tremendously good. I hope you'll join me again to talk about some of the other shows, which I hope will be equally engaging and long-lasting in your memory, for another conversation later. Will that be agreeable to you?
I'd love to.
Thank you. Well, in which case, Michael, thank you very much.
I'll see you in a bit.
Musical talk. Well, that was the rather wonderful Michael Gordon Shapiro, and we'll be hearing a lot more from him in future episodes. And rather splendidly, such was his excitement and enthusiasm for The House of Edgar that he arranged to interview the people behind it. And so one of those in-depth interviews, which is coming up in the next few weeks or so, will be about The House of Edgar. And as for Michael, do go along to his websites, and in particular, the 40-Yard Rule, which is a website where he's been discussing a lot of the shows that he's seen this year, particularly those he saw at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. So if you want to hear more about some of the shows we've discussed today, some which we're going to be discussing in the future, and some which we didn't discuss at all, then do go along there. The website is the 40-Yard Rule, and 40 is the numbers, not the letters, .wordpress.com. And Mike, of course, has got his professional website because he is a composer, and you can have a look at that and maybe contact him on mikemusic.com. It's a pleasure talking to Mike. He really knows what he's talking about, and I think that really came across in the interview. So it is a great pleasure to know there's more to come from him. But not today, because this episode is drawing to a close. But we will finish today with a song from The House of Edgar. Although not a show that I managed to get to see myself, and I have great regrets about that, I have heard its score, and it's amazing. It's really impressive. And one of the songs I like the best, and has quickly become one of my favourite songs from all of Edinburgh this year, is their musical adaptation and retelling of The Tell-Tale Heart, an Edgar Allan Poe story from the wonderful The House of Edgar. Goodbye.
I am dreadfully nervous, but I am not mad. Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story.
When I first had the faintest of foulest of thoughts, unfeasible to say, but once lodged in the back of my restless brain, it would haunt me night and day. The old man never harmed no man, but it was by his hand that I thrived. Yet I took delight in the right to ensure that by night he would no longer survive.
He had never wronged me, he had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold.
Now this is the point, you fancy me mad. You would not judge if you saw how I planned. Madmen know nothing, they know not a jot. Nervous I may be, but a madman I'm not. Yes, manic I may be, but a madman I'm not. So for 7 nights by lantern light I hid outside his door, and the time was spent to sharpen senses, tense but fearless, nervous of the nearness of the task that I perform. Lantern aloft, I slowly pushed the lonely door aside. With disbelief I saw him wake from his sleep, his eyelids peeled back wide. Now this is the point, you fancy me mad. You would not judge if you saw how I planned. Madmen know nothing, they know not a jot. Nervous I may be, but a madman I'm not. Yes, manic I may be, but a madman I'm not. Subduing my pride, I knelt down by the side and gazed upon the source of my rage, of my pain, of my fear and disdain, of an evil cold and coarse. From his mouth came too late to conceal his fate a single final cry, as with his last living look he fixed me with that pale blue vulture's eye. His pulse rang like a drum beat of thudding bass and marching snare, and it faded into the distance as I entered the vulture's glare. The night waned and I worked hastily but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse, I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then tore up 3 planks from the flooring and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye,
not even his, could have detected anything wrong. As the bell sounded the hour, I heard a knocking at the door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I to fear? There entered 3 men, officers of the police, who said they had heard a shriek. I told them the old man was away in the country, and bade they search his house well.
Now this is the point, you fancy me mad. You would not judge if you saw how I... Like a pocket watching cotton, the softest ticking caught my ear, and it rose like a double-time bass drum beat, marching ever near. And like a disease of pained unease took root deep in my gut. It seeped and spread and oozed and wept like a foul and festering cut. As it rose running red like cloying blood lumping back at the back of my throat. It mixed with the deafening dead man's pulse to produce a pounding note. The chaotic chord crescendo, it was the devil's art. I fell to my knees before the police, overwhelmed by his telltale heart.
This episode presented by Thos Ribbits and Michael Gordon Shapiro, and was produced and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2016, except for the songs where the copyright remains with the creators. And my great thanks to them all for allowing us to play these songs on Musical Talk. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our brand new website, musicaltalkpodcast.weebly.com. Or subscribe to us on iTunes. And follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at musicaltalkthos.
I've got to move on now, is that all right? Unless there's anything else you want to add to that.
I think we've covered that pretty
I think
thoroughly.
we've done it rather nicely, thank you. Well done us.
Yes.
I'll cut that bit out.
Patting myself on the back.
I'm waiting for my back to start hurting. I'm sorry, when that cue goes down, it will become a lot quieter again, so thank you for your intuitive move towards the mic as well.